Doing 7.6 present value annuities. Now in 7.5 we showed you that if you deposit or withdraw different amounts at irregular intervals, you have to use a timeline, and it's quite a lengthy calculation, but there's no other way around it. With an annuity, the big thing is equal amounts at equal intervals. In other words, the same amount every month or every week or every year. It has to be equal amounts, it has to be equal intervals. Then you don't need a timeline, you can use a formula. And the present value is usually if you borrow money, because the present value is if you get a whole lot of money now, and then your annuity, your payments are your repayments. And this is always compound interest. And used a lot for if you borrow money to buy a car or a house, something that takes a long time to pay back. Right, so if you borrow money and it's compound interest, your debt draws interest every time period. In other words, if your time periods, if your interest is compounded monthly, then it draws interest every month on what? The outstanding balance at that time. Right, so think clearly again. As you keep repaying, your outstanding balance is decreasing. So every time you have paid a bit, the interest, the percentage stays the same, but the interest amount gets a little bit less. So here's your formula. And we'll explain what it all means now. And remember again, your I is usually I over M, and your N is usually N times M. This is just your general formula. So P is present value. P is how much did I borrow. X is my installment amount. How much do I pay back every month? N is, in other words now, number of repayments. That's why we say years times how many repayments per year. I is the interest rate per period, meaning your I will be over M, where M is how many times a year. Right, let's do an example. You buy a house. It costs 800,000 rands. But usually you pay a deposit. So you're paying a deposit of 145,000 Rand. So you've got to bear that in mind. You are not going to pay any interest on the 145,000. You've already paid that. Your interest rate is 12.5% per annum, but compounded monthly. Your N is 25 years. So you have to now rework these to the correct values. The question is, what are my monthly repayments or installments? So first you have to think that the amount you borrow isn't 800,000 Rand. You're paying off 145,000. You're only borrowing 655,000. In other words, read your question carefully. If you've paid a deposit, then you're actually going to borrow less. The X is what we don't know. Then this becomes 1 plus 0.125 over 12, because it's monthly, to the minus 12 times 25. 25 years, but 12 payments per year. So your N is number of repayments. And this is again 0.125 over 12. Now you can first take everything to the other side, but you could just work this right-hand side out without the X. And I'm going to write it this way. The dot 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 means I left my full answer on the calculator. So these ways that I'm doing here is not using a financial calculator, an ordinary scientific calculator. So I've worked everything out except the X. It's got a whole long display. I'm just putting 3 decimals, but I'm not rounding it. I'm just putting dot, dot, dot to say I've actually kept it on my calculator. So what would I do to get X alone? I would, on my calculator, take 655,000 divide by answer. And I would get this, which I would round to 2 decimals correctly. I would put in my currency, and this is how much I have to pay per month for 25 years in order to repay that borrowed amount for the house.